Well, a provincial election may be brewing in Ontario sooner than voters expected. Last week, the province announced that beer and wine sales will be coming to the province's corner stores sooner than expected, just after Labor Day rather than in 2026. And by Halloween, big box retailers and supermarkets who are not already part of the action will get a chance to sell it as well.
The monopoly with the three big breweries, they're done, they're gone. We're going to make sure it's convenient for people and be treated like everyone else in the country. Be treated like everyone else down in the U.S., North America, everywhere. You can walk into a store and pick up a can of beer, a case of beer, a bottle of wine, ready to drink. And that's why we're doing it. We're keeping our promise, and we're going to move forward on this. And it's overwhelmingly popular. Overwhelmingly. I've never seen numbers this high before.
Well, to talk about how this move is triggering speculation about an early vote, we're now joined by two journalists who cover Ontario politics. Regg Cohn is a political columnist with the Toronto Star, and Sabrina Nanji is a journalist and the woman behind the Queen's Park Observer, the founder of it. Hello to both of you.
Hi.
Hi there.
So, Martin, I'll begin with you, because, this discussion may seem odd to some viewers out there, because in other parts of the country, you can get beer and wine at the corner store. Not in Ontario, not yet, at least not now. But how does this decision trigger all these election rumors?
Well, go ahead and make fun of Ontario. A lot of us do, but it's not as weird as it used to be. Without going into a history lesson, about a decade ago, I started to pay attention to this weirdness of the beer store that everybody thought was owned by the government, and it's not. It was actually, and still is, a private consortium owned by three big brewers, Labatt's, Anheuser-Busch, and Molson and Coors. And what happened, though, is that in 2015-16, the last Liberal government kind of broke that stranglehold and started to phase in for 10 years a deal whereby the beer store and the LCBO would not have the stranglehold, and it could be sold in supermarkets, in big box retailers. And Doug Ford came along in 2018 and said, oh, this is terrible. This deal is not good enough. We're going to rip up this deal, and we're going to instead allow every corner store to have stale beer. Well, he didn't say stale beer, or a small selection of just a handful of beers. He didn't say that. But he said, I'm going to bring you beer in convenience stores. And guess what? Nobody really cared. And he said in that clip that the numbers are through the roof. You can get beer and wine and cider in a lot of places now, in a lot of big supermarkets. And the question is, why is Doug Ford doing this now when that 10-year framework agreement, that contract, is still in force and which required him to actually hold his horses and wait and wait and wait. And now, a year ahead of schedule, he's moving ahead with this deal and paying the big brewers hundreds of millions of dollars. And the only question is, why would he do that? What's the obsession for our teetotaling premier? And the speculation is, and the indications are, that he is toying with the idea of an early election.
Okay, Sabrina, I'm going to ask you to build on that, because we heard it there from Martin. The premier doesn't even drink beer. He doesn't drink alcohol at all. But back in 2018, when he was first elected, he was promising $1 a beer. What is the whole politics around alcohol and beer in Ontario, and why is it triggering this early vote speculation?
Yeah, I think Martin did a good job of laying out our weird history of alcohol sales in Ontario. But you're right, this is something straight out of Doug Ford's populist playbook. Maybe he himself claims he doesn't drink, but this is something that, average everyday folks are going to be happy about. And I think a lot of people beyond Ontario's borders are surprised to learn that you can't just go to, the corner store and grab a bottle of wine or a couple of beers. Like when you're in Quebec, you just go to Le Dépanneur, and it's very easy. But the thing is that 2018, when Doug Ford initially promised this, that was a bit of a different lay of the land, right? We've now had a pandemic behind us, where, cost of living is very high. And so I think the big question is, how important is this? And, because this has fueled speculation about an early election, is this enough to keep Doug Ford in power? I'm not so sure about that on its own, but certainly the big question is, why spend, hundreds of millions to speed this up. And there are a lot of factors at play. And it would be, I think, politically advantageous for Doug Ford to go to the polls now. He's riding high in public opinion surveys. He's trounced, the Liberals, who have a new leader in Bonnie Crombie. She's still, getting her feet wet. She's still settling into her groove in the role. Marit Stiles and the NDP, the actual official opposition, are trailing in his dust. They're fresh off back-to-back by-election wins. And while they do have, a year of policy backtracks and this RCMP investigation into the Greenbelt hanging over his head, I do think that Doug Ford is leaning into that a little bit. He's spent millions of dollars not only attacking Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals, but also leaning into some of these policy reversals and backtracks and I guess gaffes that he's made over the this past year. I mean, he even says in his latest ad, you can't always get it right the first time. And I think that's, a human thing, that we all make mistakes. But then again, he is the premier of Ontario. And so I think we'll have to wait and see, if that's enough to keep him in power. A third mandate is very rare to win in Ontario, but certainly speeding up the beer store deal is one thing that is absolutely just dousing gasoline on these rumors of a potential early election. The premier himself said today on the radio, when he was asked, are we going to go to the polls earlier than our fixed election date in June 2026? And he said, stay tuned. So I think buckle up for folks in Ontario.
Okay, buckle up. Let's build upon that again then, Martin, because, how much of this has to do with the fact that, historically Ontarians seem to not want the same party in Queen's Park in Toronto and at the same time in Parliament in Ottawa. How much of this has to do with that type of reasoning?
Well, I know that's a conventional wisdom among political analysts. I personally have never believed that voters say to themselves, I love this Doug Ford guy, but now that Pierre Poilievre is in power, I'm going to vote out Doug Ford, or the reverse, or insert a name. I'm not sure voters are that calculating. I think it's worked out that way for various reasons. I don't think that's what's really motivating. That political science theory is what's motivating Doug Ford, if in fact the early election speculation comes to pass. I think he's worried, not about a change in party, but I think he's worried about Pierre Poilievre as prime minister. There is no love lost between these two leaders. They barely know each other. They barely speak to each other. And so there's no chemistry between them. I think Doug Ford is actually more comfortable privately and in public, where he shares the stage, with Justin Trudeau. I think it's more that he's afraid that Pierre Poilievre, if he follows up the way he's talking, is going to make a lot of cuts and will download a lot of that onto the provinces, and Ontario would be a sitting duck. So there's that. There's also the possibility of the economy and affordability and housing promises causing Mr. Ford more problems. There is, as Sabrina mentioned, the fact that the opposition has no traction yet, but there's no evidence that they'll have traction down the road, even with two new leaders, two very able leaders. So what I think is missing in this equation is, I'm not sure that providing beer in convenience stores, we used to call them corner stores, but they're not in every corner anymore. I'm not sure that this is something people care about. I think people thought the beer store was a pain in the butt when I first started writing about it a decade ago, and we're glad to retrench it. I don't think this is a vote winner, and so I think it's more of a peephole into Doug Ford's mind, that he is obsessed with this issue, couldn't wait to for the 10-year agreement to run its course, instead tried to preempt it, and is trying to get his ducks in a row. Mm-hmm. Just in case.
Yeah, and for people, just to almost a glossary of terms, in Ontario, you buy beer at the beer store. Quite literally, that is its name. So, Sabrina, I wonder, though, is there a danger in calling an early vote for Ford? Because, to get beer and wine sales into corner stores and supermarkets, you both talked about it. The province is paying $250 million to the privately run beer store itself as a penalty of sorts to wrap up their contract earlier. And the costs don't end there. Talk to us about the pitfalls of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to Martin's point, I don't know if this is going to be the thing that, you're going to be like, I love being able to go buy a beer around the corner, or maybe not a corner literally, but I don't know if that's the thing that's going to you get people out to the polls. But at the end of the day, Doug Ford has been in power since 2018, and there's a lot of ambitious promises that he's made, and you really can't ask Ontarians for a third mandate, whether that's earlier or, as scheduled in 2026. 2026 without showing some tangible progress on that. And so I do think that while this beer store, could end up costing us more in, rebates from the LCBO or having a 10% wholesale discount, there's a lot of, I guess, spin when it comes to the numbers. The Liberals are calling it $1 billion booze doggle, which is a bit of a mouthful. The government disputes that. But at the end of the day, I think that Doug Ford isn't going to go to the polls early until he can show some real progress on some of these really ambitious promises. Those are things like balancing the budget, building these controversial yet popular in some parts of the province, especially the 905 highways, the 413 and the Bradford bypass, and of course, liberalizing alcohol sales. And so I think, for all the talk about what the dynamics on the Hill and how that's going to affect things at Queen's Park, whether the opposition is really able to get their message out there. We've got a new leader in Bonnie Crombie that obviously has Doug Ford shaking in his boots. They're spending millions to attack her in new ad spots. I think that Doug Ford really needs to look at his own house and say, well, what's the justification for this? Because politically, it might be advantageous for Doug Ford to go to the polls early, but how do you justify that to the public beyond, this is self-serving? And, an early election could potentially cost a lot more for taxpayers. Elections Ontario might be scrambling, to get their ducks in a row before for an earlier vote. But, how does Doug Ford really justify this? Because he's still got a whopping majority, which is essentially carte blanche at Queen's Park. He can do whatever he wants. And so why does he need to go to the polls earlier beyond it being politically advantageous? I think that's the question he really needs to figure out if he really is thinking about going to the polls early. And potentially it could be that we have had a lot of policy reversals. We heard a lot from the public and we've made our mistakes, something he's already owning up to, and we need a fresh mandate from the public. So I think there's still a lot of challenges, but really he kind of needs to get his own house in order rather than looking at the opposition parties and on the Hill to really game this out for himself and his own prospects.
Okay, quickly losing time but quickly from both of you. Martin, I'll begin with you. If there were to be an early vote in Ontario, what are you hearing about a possible time frame?
Well, that's a good question. People are talking about the spring, but I wouldn't narrow it down to there. It could be any time sooner than you imagine. So we're now at the, we're now only roughly at the 2-year mark. So in the third year of the mandate, it just honestly, no matter whether it's spring or before then or even a little bit after then, it just boggles the mind that when people are looking at long waiting lists in hospital for surgery times, long waiting lists for long waits to get into a house for housing or being able to afford a house, that, hey, I got beer in corner stores, I'm not sure that's going to really cut it for people.
Okay, Sabrina, what about time frame? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I'm hearing my sources have been telling me if we go, and it's a big if at this point, early, it's going to be spring 2025, because I think that's the point where a lot of progress will be made. They're talking about having shovels in the ground and construction going on the highways, potentially closer to budget balance, all that, good stuff that you want to go to the, put to the electorate. Personally, I am hoping we go early because I think we already feels like we're in campaign mode at Queen's Park, and this is like a Super Bowl for us journalists. So I think it would be really exciting, and I'm not sure if I can go for 2 years talking about what if and what's going to happen. So that's just my personal speculation, but of course it's just speculation at this point.
Okay, well we'll put a request note to the Premier for you. Sabrina would like an earlier vote. Martin, Regg, Cohn, Sabrina, Nanji, thank you for this. Appreciate the time.
Thanks.
Thanks.